Good morning and welcome to South Point Church Online. My name is Matt and we want to welcome those of you watching from our local area here in Southern Maryland. We also want to welcome those of you watching from both different parts of the country and maybe even different parts of the world. We just want to say thanks for joining us today. Hey, we think you might be excited about the sermon series that we're in called God of the Underdogs. And here's why we think you might be excited, regardless of where you're at when it comes to faith, whether you're kind of like just checking it out, whether you're not really interested, or maybe you're kind of all in. And we discovered this back in week 1, why we all might be excited about this series called God of the Underdogs. And here's why you might be excited. We're going to put it on the screen. Is all of us will be an underdog at some point in life. Listen, this isn't an outsider insider issue. This is a human issue. All of us at some point in our life will be an underdog. At some point over the last several weeks we've talked about, we'll face a label that we can't seem to shake. At some point, we'll have a weakness we can't seem to beat, and we'll all face a circumstance that we can't control. At some point, we're all going to be underdogs. Now, if you're just joining this week or you're kind of new to this series, don't worry. Today is going to be a standalone. If you want to catch up on any of the messages, you can actually watch on demand on our website and on our YouTube channel if you'd like to catch up. What we're going to do is we're going to just dive right in and get to the main idea of today. And I'm going to put it up on the screen, and it's this right here. Sometimes the life we want is wrecked by our own weakness. And here's what I want to say, that's really difficult, right? No one likes to hear that. And that's not a really fun thing to smile about. But if we're all really honest today, sometimes the life that we want is wrecked by our own weaknesses. And here's what I've discovered, is that truth is often easy to see in someone else. Maybe you just want to type someone else in the chat because we always see it. Maybe you have that friend. They go from relationship to relationship because they're always picking the wrong kind of person to be in a relationship. And it's so easy to see that their weakness is wrecking their life. Maybe you have a coworker, maybe you know a business owner, right? And they're always looking for the quick fix or the quick way to success and riches. And so they're always trying to take shortcuts and it never works. And you can see that their weakness is wrecking their life. Maybe you know someone who is always losing friends, right? They want to be friends, they want to have friends. There's always some drama around them, and it's never their fault. And it's so easy to see their weakness. But the reality is it's so much harder to see that sometimes the weakness in us can wreck the very life that we want. And so listen, I've discovered this personally the hard way. Matter of fact, I want to share a story that just happened to me. It was probably about 6 months ago. It actually includes my beautiful bride, my wife, who I've been married to for 26 years. She's amazing and awesome. And I used to have this hobby, and I gave it up for a year or two as I was doing some other things, and life were really full. And she and one of my daughters, they were sitting there on the couches, and they were talking on their laptops, and I was kind of in there talking with them. And I made the statement, I said, you know what, this hobby that I used to do, this competitive kind of thing that I used to be a part of, I think I'm going to get back into that casually. And I kind of said it with a smile and just like that. And no lie, this is exactly what my wife said. And she said it on a dime. She was looked at me and then she kind of turned her head and she said, "Can you do anything casually?" And I went, "Whoa." And she goes, "Well, babe, I'm just saying, you just don't do anything. You're either all in or all out." And she's not lying. She's telling you the truth. You see, one of my personal weaknesses is that I'm all in and I'm hyper obsessive and I'm hyper competitive. Matter of fact, I allowed this weakness to wreck the life I wanted. It was about a decade ago. My daughter and I started playing an Xbox game online. You've probably heard it. It's called Call of Duty. And as we first kind of started, it was kind of a father-daughter deal. But as I started playing, my hyper obsession and my hyper competitive kind of kicked in. And I was like, hey, I want to see how good I can be at this game. And all of a sudden when I would lose, I would yell at the TV and I'd go, man, I must have bad internet because there's no way I could be that bad. The truth was, I really was that bad. So I said, you know what? It's our internet. So I convinced my wife to let me upgrade our internet. So then we upgraded our internet. And when I upgraded our internet, I still wasn't any better. So I went out and bought a cable to connect from my internet provider all the way into the Xbox, and I still wasn't any better. And then when the girls would get on to watch stuff or be on their laptops, I'd be like, who's on the internet? Get off the internet. When I'm playing on the computer, you need to be off the internet. And so that didn't really work well. And then I started getting a little bit addicted. And so at the end of a workday, I'd come home, spend some time with my family, and then I would get on right before bed. And I would usually make the statement that would go something like this: I'm just gonna play for like half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I'm gonna go to bed. And then I would look at my watch and it would be like 2 a.m. I'd be blurry-eyed and tired, and I'd put it down. And I was an early riser, and so it would be hard for me to get up, and I wasn't as good as I wanted to be the next day. And the life that I wanted, a good relationship with my kids and my wife, physical health, and being functional at work, was all getting wrecked by a weakness. I was yelling at my kids about the internet. I had stopped cussing most of my Christian life. And in that season when I was playing, I had actually put a sticker on the TV that says, "Don't forget you love Jesus." And like, it was just wrecking me. I was yelling at my kids. I wasn't getting the sleep that I needed physically. And I wasn't able to perform as well as I wanted to at work because I just wasn't getting the sleep. And if I was honest and you were honest, I bet that you too have a story where there's probably a weakness that you had that wrecked the kind of life that you want, right? It happens to us all. And here's what I've discovered. As a matter of fact, we're going to put it up on the screen here, and we're going to say this, that everyone has deficiencies, right? Like all of us do. Sometimes we have a deficiency and it's physical. No lie, I used to power lift, and one guy looked at me and he says, "Are you a power lifter? How does that work?" Because most power lifters are like muscular and big and buff, and like you're you. And I was like, well, thank you for the compliment. Sometimes everyone has deficiency intellectually. I love quantum physics, and I wish I was really good at that. But abstract math, I'm not very good at. What about relationally? Man, my mouth moves faster than my filter. And I can just tell you, sometimes I say things to my friends, my coworkers, and my family that I don't want to, and I just comes out anyway, and I mess it up. Sometimes we have deficiencies emotionally. In my family, bipolar and mania runs. And so I have really high highs and really low lows, and I've seen that impact my life. And then everyone has deficiencies morally, right? Like, here's what I've discovered, at least for me, my biggest fight, my lifelong fight, is against selfishness. And here's what I discovered. Listen, no matter where you're at on the spiritual spectrum, right? Like, if you're kind of like, I'm not really interested, maybe I'm just spiritually curious, I'm kind of a little bit in or all in, every one of us has to deal with these things. Listen, all of us have weaknesses that we can't seem to overcome. And it leads us to 3 brief truths that I just want to kind of go, hey, if we have a good starting point, as hard as it is to hear, we'll have some good news at the end. And so here's the 3 points. First of us is all of us have a weakness we wish we didn't have. Maybe you just want to type in weakness, like we all have them, right? Like you do, I do, and it's so easy to see them in someone else, but hard. But listen, if you have a weakness that you can't seem to beat, just welcome to the human race. All of us have a weakness we wish we didn't have. Which leads me directly into point number 2, which is all of us have a weakness we can't seem to beat. Now, there is some good news in this. If you were really honest, if I was really honest, if we were really honest, there's probably 1 or 2 things that kind of keep us stuck, that we kind of seem to like, for me, it's hyper competitiveness or hyper obsessive. Like it's just a weakness that I can't seem to beat. And here's what I discovered. Often, not all of the time, but often our greatest weakness is tied to our greatest strength. Now, that doesn't explain poor behavior or dysfunction, or excuse that, but it does explain it. And so listen, all of us will have a weakness that we can't seem to beat, which leads to a truth that you've experienced and I've experienced. We're going to put up here, and it's this. All of us have to deal with the consequences of our weakness. At some point in life, whether you're young, old, or somewhere in the middle, it doesn't matter, male, female, rich, poor, educated, not educated, it doesn't matter where in the world, where in the country that you live, all of us have to deal with the consequences of our weakness. At some point, I bet all of us have a story where a weakness wrecked the life that we wanted in some area of our life. And it leaves you and I asking a question that we must answer. We have to have an answer. And here's the question that we have to have the answer for, is how do we overcome a weakness that we can't beat on our own? And here's the reason that we need to be able to answer this question. How do we overcome a weakness that we can't beat on our own? Because if we have a weakness that we can't defeat, it could wreck our lives, the lives that we want and the lives that we were meant for. And so if we're not able to answer this question, then for many of us, myself included, we'll never experience the life that we want or the life that we were meant for. And that's why what we're talking about is so important today. And it applies to all of us, no matter where we're at when it comes to faith. Now, today I have some really, really cool news. And the cool news is there's a surprising answer to this question that is found a little bit differently than you would expect. If you showed up and said, oh, it's a church and I'm listening to a message, the answer that you might expect today is something called religion. And religion is basically, hey, stop it or try harder. And so maybe you just want to type in stop it or try harder. How many of us have ever tried those things? Like I know I've tried not to be hyper obsessive. I've tried to just stop not being competitive. Like I bet all of us when it comes to our weakness have tried hard or have tried to just stop it. And if we're all really honest, it just doesn't work. And I bet if you showed up today, you were probably thinking, I wonder if that's the answer to our problem about our weakness. And the good news is that isn't the solution and that isn't the answer. Matter of fact, the answer is so awesome. It's one of the reasons that I'm a follower of Jesus. You see, God knew that you, that me, that we would struggle, that we'd have weaknesses that we wouldn't be able to beat on our own. And God left the answer to this question, the solution. We find it in the repeated pattern in the historical record of the world. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at a person who lived in real history. His name is Gideon. Matter of fact, he's on the Jewish historical record, the nation of Israelite, and back in their previous times. And in his story, in his historical record, we discover some principles that will help you and I make sure that our weaknesses don't define who we are. So we're going to dive into that this morning and we're going to look at the historical record. It's actually in the book of Judges. It's in the Old Testament of the Bible, and we're going to take a look at it. Now, before we actually take a look at it on the screen, I want to kind of set the context of what is going on in the world so that you can kind of understand the frame of reference for the story. So, the world is busted and broken, and God has made a promise. God has made a promise that he was going to send someone to fix the world, the Messiah, the Savior, Jesus, right? But the Savior and this Messiah would come through a family called the Jewish family or the Israelites. And the Israelites, though, unfortunately, had been held captive for 400 years as slaves by the Egyptians. And God delivered them. They kind of wandered through the wilderness. They finally got their own land where they could be a people and have safety. But like you and me, between their choices and the circumstances, life started to get really broken again. And this is where we pick Gideon up. They were being brutally oppressed and they were being destituted by another nation called the Midianites. And see, back in those days, this guy Gideon, he lived in an agrarian culture, which means you couldn't go down to 7-Eleven and get a death dog. Like you couldn't go to Wawa and get a Slurpee, right? Like if you wanted something, you either had to make it or grow it. And so every season at the end of the harvest, when you would get the food and all the stuff of your hard work, this nation Midianites, they would come in, and it says like they were like more than the sands on the seashore. They would just come in these massive quantities, and they would come into the nation Israel, and they would take all the crops and all the animals that they had raised, and they would take all the things that they would have for their own subsistence and their own life, and they would rob them and steal them, and they had no military power to defend themselves. And so they were in a place where they were oppressed, they were destitute, it was a horrible situation. And so that's the context. We find Gideon unable to overcome the weakness that he had in this situation. And we're going to pick it up in Judges 6, and we're going to put it up on the screen. It says this: the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak. And I'm going to stop here for a second. I can remember when I was kind of trying to figure out who Jesus was, and like I would read the Bible. Sometimes when I'd read certain parts, I was like, I've never had an angel come talk to me. Are we kind of sure about that? And what I've discovered is just because I haven't personally experienced something doesn't mean it's necessarily true. I mean, I've never been to the space station, but I know other people have. And so like I can understand that sometimes that's a little bit like, hey, we're trying to figure that out, but obviously something happened and God showed up. Where Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, I've never threshed wheat. I don't even know what it is. I don't even know what a wine press looks like. But Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. So here's Gideon, right? And a wine press, I actually looked this up. A wine press is actually usually in the ground or there's a wall built around it. And the reason that Gideon was in a wine press is so the Midianites wouldn't see it. So he could keep it from them. Gideon was hiding. Gideon was hiding, and what he was taking some wheat to make him some bread or make his family, and he was threshing it. I guess that's like to beat it to be able to make a grain. I don't understand that process, but that's what he was doing. And it says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And do you see kind of the humor of this situation? Here's Gideon. He's hiding from the enemy, and he's just hiding a little bit of wheat to make some bread for his family. And God shows up and gives him a different name. God calls him mighty warrior. And it leads you and I to a principle today that I think is so important as we decide to live out as people who are God and have a God who is a God of the underdogs. And we're going to put it up on the screen as this. God cares more about your destiny than your deficiencies. See, if we were really honest today, at least me, and maybe some of you on the other side of the screen, we allow shame to lie to us. And here's usually how shame will lie to you or to me or to us. Shame will often tell us that our lives are going to be defined by our defects, that our life is going to be defined by what's wrong with us, that our failures and our weaknesses are what are going to define us. Here's Gideon. He's no leader. He's no warrior. He's no person out there leading the charge. We don't see him doing that. He's literally hiding, right? But yet God shows up and God sees him differently. God doesn't see him for his deficiencies. God sees him and what his destiny is. And so I want to share something with you today. For some of us, maybe we've created some wreckage in our lives from a weakness that we have. It doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it, right? And we're going, hey, will my life ever be different? Will my life ever have impact? Will I ever have the kind of life that I was meant for? And maybe like Gideon, you're kind of hiding. And I want you to know today that God doesn't see you for your weaknesses or your failures. God looks at you and he sees a destiny. God has a different and a new name for you other than the failures and mistakes that you've made. I was trying to think about kind of a story that talks about this, that our destiny is never really about our deficiencies, that God isn't interested in us trying to figure ourselves out and work it, but that he has a plan for our life. I have two beautiful daughters. Matter of fact, one of them actually has a birthday this coming weekend. And so, hey, beautiful, happy birthday. So glad that you're a part of our family. It has been an honor and a privilege to be your dad. Now, one of my daughters, she's really awesome at art. When it comes to drawing and like artistic and just her meticulous and the beauty that she can create through drawing and through other venues is literally mind-blowing. It is amazing. Listen, I struggle to draw stick figures. Like when people see my drawing or my handwriting, they laughed. She must have got it from my wife's side of the family or somebody else. I don't know how my daughter got it, but she's amazing. And so I'm always encouraging her because she often sees the things that she doesn't do well. And so she'll show me a picture and go, oh, I don't really like this, or I really don't like that. And I look at it and all I see is the beauty and talent that she has put into that picture. I can't see the defects the way that she does. And for many of us, I believe that's the way that God looks at us, that all people are made in the image of God. And it's so easy for you and I to see our weaknesses and to see our defects. But that isn't what God sees when he looks at us. God sees the destiny, and he gives us a new name. And I don't know what name or label we talked about this last week has been given to you, but the great news is we don't have to let that define us. We can let the love of God found in a person named Jesus define us. And so I want you to know your defects, our weaknesses, my weaknesses, our flaws do not have to keep us from our destiny, for they surely didn't keep Gideon from his. And so we can pick up the historical narrative, the historical record, and we're going to pick it back up in Judges 6:14, and it says this: the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have. Now I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go a little bit old school. Notice how God didn't tell him, hey, Gideon, you look a little scrawny there, bro. Hey, Gideon, you don't really have the armor that you need. Hey, Gideon, by the way, you might need a haircut, or hey, Gideon, you need to stop doing that. Notice that he didn't say, hey, I want you to go make a bunch of changes and then go do the thing that I'm calling. He says, listen, go in the strength that you have. And I just want to stop here for a little bit second. And for many of us, we feel like, hey, if we were ever going to have a relationship with a creator, if we're going to have a relationship with the God of the universe, who loved you and I so much that he died for us, that we'd have to kind of like clean ourselves up and work and get rid of our weaknesses before we come to him. And it's amazing to see that God doesn't ask him to do that. God says, go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. That's a really important phrase we're going to come back to later. He says, am I not sending you? He's kind of going, listen, just go in the strength you have. Listen, you got somebody on your side. It'll be good. You can go just as you are because someone is going to be with you that'll make sure that it's all good. And then listen to Gideon's response. Pardon me, my Lord. He's like, hey, whoa. Hey, you're God. I get where I'm at. I can see my weaknesses. I'm hiding in a wine press. But how can I save Israel? He's kind of like, hey, listen, that destiny to like make the world a better place, that destiny to have an impact, that destiny to fix what is broken, how can I do that? And he goes on to explain why he thinks he can't be that. He says, my clan is the weakest. He goes, don't you understand? Like even our tribe, Manasseh, isn't a strong family. And my clan is the weakest. And not only is my clan the weakest, I am the least in my family. So Gideon is like having this conversation with God. And he goes, listen, God, don't you get it? I'm unassuming. I'm under-resourced and I'm unknown. Like you must have the wrong guy. I'm in a wine press hiding and you're calling me a mighty warrior. And I love the Creator's response. And I hope that you hear this response today. He said, the Lord answered, I will be with you. Maybe you just want to type be with you and you will strike down all the Midianites. And it leads us to observation number 2 that is so important to make sure that our deficiencies don't define us, but that our destiny does. And we're going to put it up here on the screen. It's this: God's friendship includes the power of his presence. God's friendship includes the power of his presence. The truth is, you and I know this. Relationships have power, right? If you have good relationships, that benefits you, that creates different things in your life. It creates health and strength. And you have friends and people who can cover your weaknesses and who can support you when things are going wrong and when there's tragedy and when there's brokenness, that if you have good, solid relationships, there's a power in the presence of those relationships. In the same way you can have good relationships, we can have bad relationships. And I bet we can all think of bad relationships we had, or we've known people that have had bad relationships. And that presence of those wrong relationships have created harm and destruction. But God's friendship includes the power of his presence. I have a little phrase whenever I'm talking because I always like to share what I call true stories. So maybe if you want to just put that in the chat. This is a true story. Matter of fact, that just happened to me last week. I have a little bit of an older house. My basement has cinder block walls and an old concrete slab. It doesn't have a sump pump. And so my basement has flooded several times over the last week because here in our local county and here, at least on the East Coast, it's rained a lot. So if you're in a different part of the country or a different part of the world, that might not impact you. But we've had massive amount of rain in the last 2 weeks. And so my basement's flooded. And I don't have a wet dry vac. I'm not one of those handy guy dudes. Like that's not my wheelhouse, like I'm not good at that. So I was under-resourced. I didn't have the ability. Like the last time it flooded, my wife and my girls, they mopped it up with towels and then wrung the towels out. That's like how we got it. But my wife was out of town and the basement had flooded. My friend happened to call me that day and said, hey, how's life going? I said, pretty good. He said, yeah, but it's a little bit stinky. My basement flooded. He was like, hey, why don't I come over and help you? I go, hey man, like your life's full. Like I know that you have a lot going on, man. I don't want to inconvenience. He goes, I'm your friend. He goes, I have a wet vac. I have some stuff. I'm going to bring it over and we're going to knock it out. And that night after work, my good friend came over and he helped me do what I couldn't do by myself. He covered something that I couldn't do. And isn't that amazing? Isn't that exactly what God tells Gideon? He goes, go in the strength you have. You don't have to worry about your strength because the one who has all strength will be present with you. God's friendship includes the power of his presence. Many times I talk to people who are spiritually curious or who've maybe said, hey, I'm done with church or I'm not really interested in Jesus. And most of the time it's because they've had a bad experience with religious people. And they go, listen, I don't really want to be into religion and religiosity. And I want you to know today, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a relationship with the Creator who created you to be his son or to be his daughter. You were made to be in a relationship with God, not for religion. Matter of fact, the people that Jesus had the strongest the hardest struggle with was religious people. He wanted a relationship with people. And when you have a friendship, that presence is helpful. And then we kind of continue in the historical narrative, and we see that Gideon gets a picture of what God is going to do through him in this dream. And so Gideon is a little bit worried. He doesn't know what's going to go on. And so God says, hey, if you're worried about like me delivering all of Israel through you and your little band of 300 people against this massive army, why don't you go down to the camp and take a listen? And so we pick up this conversation that is in the historical record. And it says, Gideon arrived just as a man was telling his friend a dream. He goes, I had a dream. He was saying, a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. Notice it's just a barley bread. Like it wasn't anything impressive. It shouldn't have been able to do anything. But this bread came into the Midianite camp and it struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. I mean, you would never expect bread to be able to do something, but there was a force behind the bread that accomplished what the bread couldn't do by itself. And then we hear the rest of it. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. And the historical record tells us that with just 300 men at the beginning, Gideon routs the Midianite army, and that God uses Gideon to deliver the people from bondage and destitution and oppression. And so Gideon had purpose. And it leads us into observation number 3, and we're going to put it up here on the screen, is God has a purpose for your life. God has a purpose for your life and for my life. And if we're really honest, one of the reasons that we often doubt that we have purpose is because we think we need something called strength or power to have purpose in life. And what I discovered is impact doesn't come from strength. And then here's the coolest thing. I mean, I think this is what's so amazing about Jesus, is Jesus gives people human dignity. Matter of fact, when Jesus came and said, listen, not only am I going to die for people, not only am I going to pay for all the weaknesses and all the mistakes, I'm going to invite you into a partnership to bring up there down here. You see, you know this and I know this. What's broken in the world is not a lack of talent. Just write that in the chat, right? It's not lack of talent. The problem in the world isn't a lack of talent, right? It's a lack of character. The reason the world is busted and broken is because people are busted and broken. The world doesn't need more talent. The world needs people with character and with integrity who are for other people. As I was thinking about how to explain this, there's this person that came to my mind, and you might know her name. Her name is Mother Teresa, and you've probably heard of her. You know, Mother Teresa from Calcutta. She started a revolution. She started a way to serve people, and she impacted millions. She was brought before presidents and dignitaries, and she's known worldwide and sainted. And here's the amazing thing about Mother Teresa, is that she didn't really have any power. I mean, if you ever have seen her, she was barely 5 foot tall, and I think they were giving her a couple inches. She had no financial power. She wasn't rich. She didn't have a lot of finances to manipulate people. She had no political influence. She had no relatives that were in places of power, right? And she had no intellectual power. She wasn't like she was this super intellect that could outthink people. You know what her impact was? She served and loved people. And here's what we and you and I discover. Destiny is never about power. Impact isn't about strength. Impact and destiny all come from purpose. And God has called you and God has called me to purpose. Matter of fact, my guess is that if you're watching this and you're kind of on the fence about church and God and Jesus, it's probably, again, because you've had experience with people who claim to be followers of Christ. And you're always kind of like, hey, I would expect Christians to like love other people and to be for them. And the truth is, when we hear and see this story of God showing up in Gideon's life, is God didn't show up and bless Gideon just for Gideon. It wasn't about Gideon getting accolades. It was about Gideon bringing aid to others. And I want to say, if you're here and you said yes to Jesus and you're a follower of Jesus, the power and presence God gives us isn't so that we can consume. It's so that you and I can contribute. It's not for our accolades. It's to bring aid to other people. Which leads us to a truth that I want to kind of sum up, if I was going to wrap it up in a neat bow and go, hey, this is kind of the main idea I want you to hear today, I would put it this way. God's purpose and presence has the power to outdefine our weakness. Listen, I wish I could tell you that I'm not hyper obsessive. I am. And I wish I could tell you that I'm not hyper competitive. I still am. That's why I don't play in the church softball league. Just type amen. We're glad, Pastor Matt, you don't make us look bad in competitive areas. But that's also tied to my strength of tenacity and focus and willingness to do whatever it takes to finish, right? And so here's what I've discovered is God's purpose, his purpose for us to bring up there down here, and God's presence, his Holy Spirit that comes and lives on the inside of us, that walks alongside of us because he's our friend. His purpose and his presence has the power to outdefine my brokenness and my weakness. My life and my destiny isn't defined by my crazy, but instead it's defined by God's goodness, his willingness to partner and to be present with me. And the same is true for you. You probably have a weakness you can't beat. But the good news is the answer to that isn't found in trying harder. The answer to that isn't found in just stop it. Those are religious answers. But Jesus comes along and he says, no, there's not an answer of try harder or do better. Jesus comes along and says, come follow me. Jesus talks about a relationship with God, that our relationship with God, his presence, and that he gives us the dignity of purpose actually gives us power in our lives to outdefine our weaknesses. So I want to give you an analogy to try to kind of explain this in a way that I think that you might understand. And so it's going to be a sport references. And for those of you that don't like sports, I apologize. Sports is kind of my wheelhouse. So I'd ask that you stay with me. Don't check out, but I want to kind of give you an analogy, and I think it'll make sense, so kind of stay with me. And it's going to kind of date me, to be totally honest with you. Maybe you just want to wave a hand or put MJ in the comments, but how many of you have ever heard of the basketball player Michael Jordan? Just type MJ, do the little hand wave or the little smiley face, right? Emoji, right? How many of you have heard of Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan at one point was one of the most recognizable people on the planet. He was part of the dream teams in the Olympic. He was part of a record-setting Bulls basketball team that won 6 championships. And there was this story that came out after Michael Jordan retired about his practice habits and how the coaches used to run practices. And one of the things that they would do is they would scrimmage, is Michael Jordan would be on one of the teams, and the scrimmage team, and whatever team Michael Jordan was on would usually win. And every once in a while, the coach would blow the whistle in the middle of the scrimmage, right? And he would switch Michael Jordan from the team that was usually winning, and he would put him onto the losing side. And the autobiographies and those who tell the story of Michael Jordan would say the team that Michael switched to that was losing often became the team that won. And the team didn't win because they got stronger or they got better. They won because they had a presence that they didn't have before. And they walked off the court winners, not because they got better at their weaknesses, but because someone's presence was able to do for them what they could not do for themselves. And that's exactly what Jesus offers you and I. At some point, we're all going to have a weakness that we cannot beat. And Jesus looked down and he said on the cross, it is finished. It means that he knew our weaknesses. He knew our flaws. He knew our defects. And he was still looked at us and he didn't see those things. He paid the price for our failures and our flaws so that we could be in a relationship. And our impact and our destiny is not defined by those things. It's defined by who we choose to allow to be present in our lives. And so I want to ask a challenge today. I know that we have different kinds of people watching this, and maybe you're watching this and you're spiritually curious. If you were honest with yourself, you probably have a weakness that you can't beat by yourself. And so my question and my challenge to you today, as you wrestle with that honestly, is the answer to try harder, or is it possible that you could trust God, who doesn't ask you to fix yourself, but who loves you where you're at? Maybe you're here today and you're somewhere in the middle of the road. I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you today. Are you on in a real relationship with God? Or are you kind of relying on kind of that hotline of like, hey, I'm a crisis hotline and I'm going to call God, or am I in a real relationship with him? And some of you here today, you might be all in. You might be going, listen, I want to passionately follow Jesus. I've said yes to him. I want to try to figure that out. I want to ask you and challenge you to this question. Are the blessings, is the power and presence that God has brought in your life, is that about your accolades? Or are you bringing aid to those who need it? As Jesus said, our prayer should be to bring up their heaven down here on this busted and broken world. You see, I discovered a truth, and I bet you discovered this truth. The world doesn't need more talented people. It needs more people who will love people just the way they are and who will do what is right. Because our destiny is never determined by our deficiencies. The truth is God's presence and his purpose and his power can out-define our weaknesses. I hope that encourages you and challenges you today that there is a God of the underdogs who is for you. Let me pray for us today. Hey, God, you rock. I love that the solution to how do we overcome the weaknesses that we can't beat isn't try harder or just stop it. It's to invite you into a real and genuine friendship and relationship, and that you give us a purpose, and your presence will outweigh and outdefine our flaws. That is the whole message of the gospel. We don't earn it. We don't work for it. It is given freely through grace by what Jesus did on the cross. Thank you for being willing to step into our team, our little team life, to help us win and have the kind of life that we're meant for. God, I pray that you would give us eyes to see you and ears to hear you and hearts that are soft and open to you. We pray this in Jesus' name. And as we say every week, never forget, you matter deeply to God.